perceive the world. But I never really got a whole lot of the message. So until I was about 12 or 13, I had a lot of things going on. And I was interested in the paranormal and stuff. And then I went through a period as a teenager of being very involved in church and thought, okay, this is wrong. So I put it away for a while. And then I got to college and I started studying anthropology and history and realized that, maybe there, again, and I was also the sort of person that it didn't really go away. The things didn't stop just because I didn't want them to be there. So I went through sort of a period of being kind of agnostic, and then I got, actually, of all things, through reading science fiction and fantasy, I got very interested again. And through that, met a lot of people that were doing various forms of magic and divination and different things. And one thing kind of led to another. And when I moved from Mississippi to Denver, Colorado, I became involved in, I lived with some people for a while who practiced Wicca, and I studied Wicca with them for about 6 years. And that was when I had my first experience with serious experience with card reading. I had a little bit of it when I went to school in Mississippi, but not very much. And then I moved to California and became involved with the Fellowship of the Spiral Path. The people I was living with were doing that. That was a sort of a big pagan organization that had a actual sort of a pagan seminary. And I was involved in that, studying both Wicca and later Asatru, which is basically Norse traditions, and that's mostly what I practice now. But I had things like, as part of my training, I was a high priestess in True Coven in the Castro, where it was mostly gay men during the height of the AIDS crisis, so I did an awful lot of work with trance and death and passages and crossing. And again, I found that things like cards and other forms of divination, specifically a lot of trance work, were extremely useful for people who were in the process of crossing over, and both in helping them and to cross themselves and maybe helping to understand for myself what was happening. On the other hand, ever since I was a young child, I was also very interested in a man called Edgar Cayce, who is known in the 1930s as the sleeping prophet, who did a lot of writing in the U.S., and he was someone who would go into trance, and he would talk about healing and things, and also people's past lives. And he didn't remember any of it usually when he was awake. He had to be told what he said. But I think Edgar Cayce has also been a tremendous influence in how I view the world and how I view the other world, as well as, say, I personally find that the Norse, the sort of Viking cosmology of Freyr and Freya and Odin and Thor, to be very useful to me. But I'm also, I think that that's been sort of a part of a long process. And I think the major thing for people is that it's helpful to have some sort of system, whether that's Buddhism, whether it's metaphysical Christianity, or whether it's Norse being Asatru. It just sort of helps you put a framework on it.
Sure. Okay. Well, next up we have Plain.
Hi. Could you describe your understanding of the history of runes and the tarot or other related cards? And might these be residual items from a high civilization in the past?
Okay, first the runes. My husband would be much better at this than me because he has a PhD from Cambridge in Old Norse studies.
In runology?
And no, actually he did his dissertation on Odin, god of death. And his specialty was Viking religious motifs, especially in terms of death. And he did study the runes in relation, because the runes were believed to have been brought by Odin to the world. And he actually speaks Old Norse and can translate Icelandic and all this. But the Cliff Notes version from him is basically that we don't know exactly when the modern runes came in. There are some of them that seem to be influenced by the Latin alphabet from Rome. The idea of writing probably came indirectly from Rome. But once again, there's these two issues. There's the actual physical history. By the Viking age, they are definitely be used as a form of writing. Vikings turn out, or Northmen as they call themselves, turned out to have been highly literate. There's a find in Russia. There's a city that they found that's been sort of buried in the mud, where there's just thousands of letters that they may be 100 years translating. That's just average people writing to each other. So the runes were definitely an alphabet by 900, 1000. What we don't know is, were they being used as a form of divination? historically. My feeling is probably they were, because the alphabet itself has almost always been used as some form of divination, because letters are kind of magic. But we don't have any proof of it being used until the sort of 19th century, almost Nordic revival that happens in Scandinavia. But there's no doubt that runes mean specific things, because we have very ancient poems, at least 1,000 to 1,500 years old, that talk about the runes and what they symbolize. So you can take those runes and you can use those symbols and use the 24 runes of the Futhark to use as divination. Is that historical or not? We don't know, but it does seem to work. The tarot I actually had to look up this week because I wasn't sure myself, and the tarot seems to be, originally it was 14th century playing cards, very much like the runes being an alphabet. Again, there's no direct evidence of them being used in the Middle Ages for divination, but by the 18th century, they start being used as divination, and they start becoming more codified and more the same. But they really, really seem to have been formed as a modern system in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they formed the basis of the modern tarot today. Residual from items from a high civilization, I would think, especially in the case of tarot cards, and to a lesser degree the case of the runes, probably not, except in the sense that divination, and I have this in my notes, is of all sorts, including astrology, probably is that old, or various forms of it, maybe not modern astrology, but the idea of looking at the stars for guidance. Trance work, probably, we see evidence of that on the cave paintings like 38,000, 40,000 years ago. Things like dowsing for water, pendulums, or looking into water, those probably go back as long as people have been upright and looking at the world around them and the other world, sleep dreaming and trance work. So tarot and runes, maybe not, but the other stuff, certainly.
Well, Joseph Farrell's book, one of his books recently, makes the case that the I Ching has a lot of aspects of some residual element that might be many, many thousands of years old. So I suspect there's a lot that we just don't know. That's all you can say. By the way, a different question would be, have you had any changes in how you read things over the years? Are the impressions different, or perhaps your techniques, or how you approach things?
Just one comment on the I Ching. That would not surprise me, because China's civilization, if you go back 5,000 years, it seems you get the same motifs. It's very unusual in that part of the world, even from mundane anthropology, things go back many thousands of years. So that wouldn't surprise me, at least. And I don't know much about the I Ching. But getting back to your question, yes, I would say that my techniques have changed quite a bit, although it's more like an adding of things rather than a change of perspective. I started out doing mostly trance work, learning to do past life, a group of friends, meditating, guided meditations, and dream interpretation. And then about 25 years ago, when I got to Denver, I also picked up the side cards for the first time, and I felt a real connection to the side cards, which were then a new deck. And then when I got to California, I started doing some basic runes and things as part of the spiral training. I only got really serious about the runes this past year, but as part of a priestess training, we had to learn all kinds of divination, and each time you learn something else, like whether it's working with a pendulum on a map or scrying in a bowl of water, you tend to get, I don't think it adds to what you can do, and you may find I find that certain techniques work better for different kinds of questions, or perhaps at different stages or periods of my life. So that's what I would say on that.
Any rough explanation of when you would choose one versus another? Say, when would you use a pendulum, for example?
Okay, I use a pendulum for two things. In California, we were using it working with maps because we were trying to find out what areas had traditional land spirits or certain energy points, which might have been sort of graveled over by the modern city. And like, for example, we walked around and found an influence of water with the pendulum on the place we were living, and then got maps and discovered that there was actually a river that ran under our house, which later flooded. And things like that. So you can use it that way. I use the pendulum now, recently. I use it with cards because when I'm reading for clients, because I'm not the sort of psychic that easily picks up dates or timelines from the air, but I've discovered I can hold the pendulum over the cards and just ask things like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and often get fairly accurate answers. Now, with that particular type of pendulum work, I probably am unconsciously influencing the pendulum, but I have to trust that my unconscious is doing that in such a way as to get the right answer. Can't bring it consciously out of my mind. But some of the other things like dowsing, which I've only done once, there was an old Irish dowser that came to visit, and he handed me his tools, and they just took off, and I was scared to death. I have to tell you, it was like something totally outside myself. That's a different sort of thing altogether, but that's where it's like it sort of takes over you. But the pendulum, I think, is really useful for working with maps or working to answer questions. Other people use them to in healing techniques to find out where somebody's maybe affected by an illness, but I've never tried that myself.
Okay, thanks. Well,
sure.
Here's another question from Gemini.
Hi, Melody. I'm curious to know how you would describe the energy of the flow of the tarot reading between the reader, the subject, and the universe.
Okay, the cards, in the hands of a good psychic, cards or any other divination tool for that matter is a focus. You're using that card or the bowl of water or whatever you're using to tap into the flow of energies that are affecting the client and are out in the universe in general, hence the whole card of the day, or even looking into a bowl of water to see the stream of time to try to predict the future. It's not the card and it's not the bowl of water. It is making that connection, and they're just sort of, you just sort of have to trust. I mean, there may or may not be something like the great collective unconscious, like Jung wrote about, but there's definitely something out there that people can tap into. And some people do it naturally easier than others, but I believe that anybody can be trained to tap into it to some degree, and that for everybody is going to do it a little bit differently.
Okay, and just to follow up a little bit, in the introduction you had said that you had been reading cards for people and then you kept getting the same card over and over. Do you feel like that perhaps that's your energy influencing the cards? Do you find that ever happens?
Yes, and that's why I tend to do things like I have 3 different decks of psi cards that I will interchange, because it is totally possible for a deck to get what I call stuck, which whether I'm doing it or the deck is doing it, it just, or unconsciously the paper is getting rattled to where you feel a different place. The other thing is usually if I'm getting stuck, it becomes rather obvious, or sometimes the client gets stuck. I get this a lot, in readings where somebody really, really wants something, like a young girl really, really wants a particular boyfriend, and she just keeps asking the same questions over and over again. And in the beginning, it may be very negative, but it later becomes kind of positive. And really what's happening is she so wants this to happen that she's influencing the cards. And, maybe she'll be influencing reality too, but at the moment, she's just influencing the cards. And if I feel like I'm getting in the way of a reading, I have 2 choices. I can either back off and tell the person, look, I'm sorry, this isn't working today. Let's try it again later. Or the first thing I'll do is to switch decks or even switch techniques so that I'm changing the focus, and hopefully that will allow the energy to flow better.
Okay. Thank you for that. And next up, we have Plain.
Yeah, I know you use different types of cards, and how do you know when to use what type of card? Are there pros and cons of some decks over the others, or is it a matter of the question that you're dealing with, or is it a type of spread, or?
The answer to that is yes, which I don't mean to be funny there, but it is definitely, the question really answers itself, in that the different kinds of decks